Good to see you again, Gabe.
Good to see you again, too.
So we're going to talk today about Pinocchio, but I didn't make you watch Pinocchio.
No.
What did I make you watch?
So instead of watching the lovely animated film, I watched, I think, roughly 10, maybe 11 hours of a video breakdown by Professor Jordan Peterson, where he really goes into depth about Pinocchio and tangents off into a million different things and talks about, pretty much everything. I don't think there was anything that he didn't at least touch on. But
Yeah. Which is probably kind of a weird follow-up to what we talked about last week. So Wendell Berry last week, how would you summarize our conversation that we had?
Yeah, so last week we talked about Wendell Berry's short essay, The Responsibility of Being a Poet. And we touched on a lot of different things, but for the most part, it was focused on what does it mean to be a responsible creative, and how should you approach creative work. That was kind of the basis. And then also, what is creative work and how is creative work interpreted?
Right.
And yeah, to be honest, I'm interested going into this because I've been kind of given my reading or like watching assignments without too much information, and the through lines were pretty hard to find. Like that was something that I was like, oh, like this is gonna be interesting to see how we can tie these things together and make it feel cohesive. So
Yeah. So Barry, interestingly enough, in trying to define the responsibility of a poet, and like we said last week, I think you can speak broadly of this in the sense of the artist, makes an interesting statement at the beginning where he says, in order to do that, you kind of have to talk about what is poetry or what is art in order to say, how am I going to do this thing responsibly? If I want to be a responsible woodworker, I have to define what woodworking is to some degree, at least loosely. And he does that. And he does that, like we talked about this. He talks about a poem being a nexus point of a series of reminders.
Yeah.
He talks about reminders in all kinds of avenues. And one of the things that I really drilled down on so that we could focus on that is to be reminded requires an audience member who has a conscience. Because you can't be, like if you're a thoughtless individual, I can't remind my toaster of the Iliad or its manufacturing line or anything like that.
Right.
So the way he uniquely starts to define it as this thing that has a lot of different qualities is pretty interesting. Because at the core of the conversation I want to talk, we're not going to get to Pinocchio for a little while.
That's all right. That's how it was in those videos too. I think there was 2.5 hours before we even looked at Pinocchio.
Yeah. But so for folks who are interested, it's Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning course. The first 5 episodes, he briefly, in Jordan Peterson style, briefly is looking at Pinocchio, and he's going through and trying to give a psychological interpretation of that film, which is a unique thing to do. And whether you agree with him or not, we're not going to talk too much about his particular points, I don't think. But I want to use that as a jumping off point to get at this question of what do we value in art? Because Barry is very interesting in the sense of saying the responsibility of the poet, and in particular what a good poem is. And so he's acknowledging that, frequently have people say things like, that's not worthy to be called art. And what they're doing is they're establishing a high definition of art. So they're saying something like, art is, the best of this particular human endeavor. And we talked about that a little bit last week, the best painter is making art.
Yeah.
Everyone else is trying to make art.
Yeah.
And they're making cheap versions of something else that we wouldn't call art. And obviously what Barry is establishing is a much broader definition. There's a lot of things that remind you of the different aspects of that nexus of reminders, whether it's personal history, actual history, received history from other people, the ability of a medium, what can sentences and grammar do?
Yeah.
All of those things that an artwork might remind you of. It's like, well, a a radio jingle
Yeah.
qualifies.
Yeah. And I think I would also add that one of the, I think, important points that Berry made in that essay is that there's that saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? And in some ways, he was drawing a lot of connections to that type of argument as we're talking about reminders and talking about things that serve as these nexus points. The viewer has an enormous role to play in whether or not something is art. We talked about the person who might go to a gallery and say that's not art to me, and that being a valid thing to say to some people that really might not be art. And
like it's a true thing.
It is. It's a true
It's
thing.
beyond valid in the sense of logic. It's not only valid for them to say that's not art to me. They're saying a truth.
Yeah.
As in they aren't seeing any kind of nexus of meaning in whatever they're looking at.
Yeah.
It's very. Have you watched Westworld at all?
Like an episode or two.
You know, in the first episode, Dolores is given a photograph, and it's a photograph of the real world, not the Westworld.
Yeah.
And she's like, I don't know what this is.
Yeah.
Like she literally looks at it like it's noise.
Yeah, she can't figure it out.
She can't figure out what it is. It's great. Like we actually see the world that way. So I have a memory of the first time I watched Star Wars. And there's this, I was like a young kid, and there's a scene where Luke's looking through his, space binoculars, whatever they are.
Yeah.
And he's looking at creatures and sand people. Yeah. And I remember as a kid, the first time I watched it, I could not interpret the image. Because I didn't know what a bantha was. I didn't know what a sand person was. I had no frame of reference for what they could be.
Yeah.
And so it's like a black and white vision.
It's kind of staticky.
Yeah, it's all staticky because space binoculars don't work that well.
Yeah.
And so he's like looking through there, and I remember as a kid, like I have this memory in my mind of looking at that and not seeing anything. All I saw was static. But then, like immediately afterwards, you see the banthas, you see, much more clearly. They're specimened out, banthas with a blue sky behind them in the desert. And then the second time I watched it, then I could see the banthas in that image.
Yeah.
And it's like that kind of experience of if you don't have the frame or the context, and that's where Berry gets at something really unique there when he says it's not necessarily that it's communicating a meaning, but it's reminding you. As in, a key part of experiencing the work of art is what you bring to it. Because if you bring to it nothing, if you're a person with amnesia, or this has even happened when they are able to like do different surgeries on people who've been born blind so that they can suddenly see.
Yep.
They do not know how to, frequently, they don't know how to interpret the difference between a physical apple and a painting of an apple.
Yeah.
And there's so much of a response of we give in our vision of something because of all of the ways our cognition works to block out everything else and focus on what we're attentive to.
Yeah.
So if you don't have any kind of attentive framework, then you actually don't really see anything. It's very, and even in the biblical sense, there's a moment when Jesus heals the blind man with mud on his eyes.
Yeah.
He says everyone looks like trees. It's like he can physically see.
Yeah.
But he doesn't know how to interpret that.
Yep.
And he needs another form of healing in order to start to see men as men and not trees. It's like there's a cognition there where we bring into our interpretation something.
Yeah.
Which is very bizarre.
It is. It's very the relationship between object and viewer, or interpreter and message is a really complicated relationship that I think is it's not given enough weight. Maybe I think about. I'm taking a photography class right now. And one of the things I'm always struck by is when I'm taking a photo of something. Oftentimes I'll be able to see an image, and I'll be able to pick out, I think there's something interesting there. And then once I take that image, I look at it, and it looks, there's too much going on. And what I'm not realizing is that when I look at something, my brain is able to really, really successfully pick out just the interesting parts and kind of focus in on what makes something interesting. And then when you're looking at that same thing as a photograph, you're not able to do the same kind of thing. You interpret it all as the same sort of thing. And so much of what we've been talking about is so much of photography is learning how to show somebody else what you see is important in a scene, or show somebody else what is important.
Yeah, we're jumping like ahead probably three or four different videos till we get there, but that's exactly where I'm headed to some degree. Is the role of the artist is not necessarily to make something, but to frame something.
Yeah.
But we'll get there.
We'll talk about it. We'll take a couple steps back.
But so let's go back to this idea of value. So if an artwork is working in a ton of different avenues, like that thing we were talking about, the art as the highest form of an endeavor. Berry mentions this. He talks about how one of the things that artwork reminds us of is the like the quality of the medium. Oh my goodness, like words in a specific rhyming schema, in a specific meter, or like the iambic pentameter, that stuff, they can be so wonderfully crafted. So that is an aspect.
Yeah. And
then there are a group of individuals who take that singular aspect and they decide that's the most valuable part of artwork. Is how far does this thing push our sense of quality of art? And clearly in the 20th century, that's not the concern anymore.
No,
we've got urinals up there.
Yep.
We've got artists canning their own feces.
Yep.
And then we've got, in the 21st century, we've got bananas taped to walls.
Yeah.
None of those, well, you could argue that they have a high degree of craft.
Yeah.
But none of those are like Michelangelo carving the David.
It's very the relationship between viewer and artist has gotten increasingly more complicated. That's something that now has all of these different layers of commentary and irony, and in some cases even I would say when you're talking about urinals and other kind of disgusting things put on display in museums, even this level of like contempt and disillusionment with like what's happening there.
Yeah. Ooh, we'll get to that. That's a great question. Why does the general audience, why are they so angry with artists? But before we get there, let me ask you this. So you're a student of the arts.
Yep.
But we're here in West Michigan, so it's not like you're in the center of art activity in New York.
No.
What, in your opinion, as you've gone through these classes and you've, I'm assuming in the last 3.5 years, your view of art has probably expanded. Like when you came in, you thought maybe art meant like drawing and painting, maybe was it that limited?
It was more so. I actually remember the specific moment. So the first art class I ever took here at Hope, and this was before I decided to be an art major. This was just an art class I'd taken on a whim. Was a sculpture class, and at some point during the opening lecture of this sculpture class, I had this realization that you could make a sculpture out of literally any material you wanted to. Whereas up until that point, I had thought of sculpture as being entirely something that had to be, I think, steel and marble were like the only two materials in my head that I was like, it can be like a Calder where you have this big red steel object, or it can be like Michelangelo's David. It can be like this beautiful stone thing.
Right.
And then I think the image that I saw, and I forget the artist, but it was an alleyway stacked full of chairs. I mean, we're talking thousands of chairs. And we're thinking, like, looking at that and being like, that's so cool, and that's a sculpture, and that's made out of chairs.
Yeah.
What else could you do?
I cannot pronounce that artist's last name. Sar something.
We'll put it in the video.
We'll put the image up.
Yeah.
It's great, and it's powerful. In some cases, it might be if Berry is onto something, there might be manners in which it reminds people of far more things than Michelangelo's David.
Yeah.
Especially if like think about what is required of you as a viewer to have David remind you of things. If you've never read the Bible, you don't know the story of David.
Yeah.
If you've never seen the human figure, you don't know what if he's a good like a well-made figure, or if it's a poorly made figure. If you've never carved stone, you don't have any concept as to how difficult is it to make this. If you've never if you've literally never seen anything, if you're a baby, it's nothing. It's a thing standing in front of you.
Yeah, and I would even add that so I've never gotten to see it in person, but I have a friend who is recently over and got to see it, and they were like, I didn't realize how big it was. Like that was the thing that shocked them. They were like, yeah, I've only seen it in images, so I assumed that it was maybe life size, maybe a little bit smaller. It's not. It's huge. Like it towers over you. And they said that in and of itself, they had this completely different interaction with it, where all of a sudden it was reminding them of way more. They're like, oh, in person, it really makes you think about like biblical myth. Like that's like your feeling is like this Old Testament hero when you're actually there.
Right. And you can see it in like the round, and it's wonderful. But you can see like Berry's idea here is filling in a lot more richness because, as a student of the arts, what makes an artwork valuable?
Yeah.
Like, in not just for you, but what do you think the thing we call the art world?
Yeah.
What does the art world value in an artwork, in your opinion?
So, in the art world in particular, I think I'd like to make the distinction that like maybe I want to separate the art world from the art market from right now, because when you talk about artist valuation and blue chip art and all of that sort of things, there's this whole it gets really messy really fast.
I don't want you to separate.
You don't want to separate
because that's what I mean when I say the art world.
Yeah.
What the average person, when they're looking at the news, what they see is this Van Gogh broke records. Sotheby's brought in X billion dollars this week.
Okay.
What are they valuing?
Yeah. So in that sense, I think, in that world, there's a couple things that get placed really, really highly, which is notoriety of the artist, right? Like whether or not people are going to say this name and your average person on the street is going to recognize it. Like, for example, even though me and you can both picture that sculpture with all the chairs in it, neither of us can actually recall the artist's name right off the top of our head. But Van Gogh, you say Van Gogh, every person watching this video has a picture of Starry Night popped in their head. That's why Starry Night is worth so much, because like it's something that's known, it has notoriety. Then on top of that, there's also this sense of things becoming, I would say, representational or maybe even iconographic of a time period or a movement. So whether or not a piece of artwork is able to sum up some period of time. So again, using Van Gogh as an example, what Van Gogh really represents, and we talked about this, is like he represented a departure from the modern way, or what was the modern way of painting.
We'll say contemporary.
Yeah.
Because he was a modernist.
He was, but
his contemporaries were doing something, and he departed from that.
And because he departed from that in a way that was successful, and then people like recognize now as beautiful, that's something that sets him apart. Because there's a lot of people who can who have mimicked Van Gogh, or there's
Is it more important today that Starry Night is beautiful, or that Van Gogh is well known?
Today, I would honestly say I think it's more important that, in terms of price tag, the fact that he's well known. I think that.
Yeah. Can you imagine if you were trying to test that? If you're trying to test this theory, let's say there's two competing views. Van Gogh is valuable because it's beautiful, or Van Gogh is valuable because he's well known. What kinds of things would you look for evidence to support one or the other?
I think probably the best example would be taking I think the best way to do it would be to look at sketchbook material. Take sketchbook material from a relatively unknown artist, and take sketchbook material from Van Gogh. So neither one is like completely recognizable for what it is, and to say this back of the napkin sketch was made by Van Gogh. This back of the napkin sketch was made by some other painter who has a lot of talent, but people aren't going to know their name. And I can guarantee that the one that was made by Van Gogh, regardless of quality, will like sell for more.
So what is that, because the Van Gogh drawing is more beautiful?
No, not at all. I think that's because notoriety again.
So that would be a great test to do.
Yeah.
To see what is the thing that's being valued. And in that sense, you're saying notoriety is more important than what the artwork actually is.
Yes, I think in situations where you could put, we'll say, two paintings of like comparable beauty or comparable aesthetic kind of like value to each other, the thing that's going to separate them apart is going to be artist's name. Again, maybe that factor of like what it represents in terms of its time, that sort of thing.
Yeah. One of the things we're going to read pretty soon is called How Art Works by Ellen Winter. Mm-hmm. What we just described are several of the tests that she does.
Oh.
So she's a psychologist at Boston College, and she's testing these claims to try to figure out what do we value in the arts. And in America, it is clear brand is more important.
Yeah.
Which gets at so much of like, for the average person who hasn't kept up with art, and they see something just hideous, you know, like I don't think most Banksy pieces are that interesting. They don't have a high degree, like they're like one-line jokes for the most part.
Yeah.
They're not that interesting. And what he has though is brand recognition. And so knowing the ins and outs of the art world to some degree, like I'm not by any means a blue chip artist, but I've sold over 200 works of art. So I have some history with understanding how the market works. And I understand what people are looking for generally and how to succeed in that. Now, I'm kind of succeeding in it. Yeah. And there's lots of reasons for that, but that's a different conversation. But what is known about the art market in America is that brand recognition is by far the deciding contributing factor to how an artwork gets literally a price tag and how that goes up. And there's a great documentary that maybe at some point I'll have you watch, but I actually don't think there's too much to think about with it. But there's this great line. HBO did this documentary called The Price of Everything. And the title comes from a very wealthy collector who does a lot of interviews. And he's older and he has a crazy art collection that's very valuable. And he has this weird line where he says, everyone knows the price of everything, but the value of nothing. And it sounds all artsy. And on one hand, it's like a beautiful thing of like, man, we can put price tags on Van Gogh, but do we really know the value? Except the documentary is edited in a clever way. Earlier in the film, he actually tells you what he values. And he says a line where he says this. He says, as long as I can help it, I try not to pay for anything. And it's like he's implying there what he values.
Yeah.
He uses his artwork to peddle influence and avoid taxation.
Yeah.
Because he can transfer an object that has a external provenance that tells everyone its value, and not only that it's going to increase in value because of the way that the museums and exhibition system works.
Yeah.
He can then give someone a $1 million painting and he doesn't have to get taxed.
Yeah.
It's crazy. On top of that, because of like the Panama Papers came out, and there's this whole entire thing that shows that no one really knows who owns these objects.
Yeah.
They're all hidden behind hedge funds or shell companies.
Yep.
And there's all of this trading of these things moving around. And so it's like when the average person is looking at the art market, they walk into a museum and they think, how on earth is this thing worth X million amount of dollars?
Yeah.
And it's like, because they're valuing something you're not.
Yeah.
They're not looking at it and saying, this experience of the piece is so enjoyable, I would pay $10 billion to have it. $10 million to have it. That's not what they're saying.
Yeah.
They're saying, I understand what I can use this for.
Yeah.
And that's where like artists for a long time now, since really the 60s, have been pushing against this commodification of art. And that's why you get a lot of weird things. And even still, like the banana taped to the wall.
Banana taped to the wall is a perfect example. Yeah.
Sold for $150,000.
Yeah.
It's like, how is that worth that?
Yeah.
Because that's not what they're looking at.
Yeah.
They're looking at all kinds of other contributing factors as to what this thing will be. It's far more like a bond.
Yeah.
You know, like what the heck is a stock?
Yeah.
Like, where do you have it?
Yep.
Where does it go? Like, how is it worth things? It's like they're trading in art in the same manner.
For sure.
That frequently distracts us because we as a culture worship money. And so when we see that money, like we all have like a dollar bill reminds us of something.
Yeah.
It reminds us of what we can get with it.
Yeah.
So when you walk into a gallery and you know this painting sold for an insane amount of money,
yeah,
It's hard to overcome that reminder.
Yeah, it is. I think a really good example of this, going to the banana tape the wall piece, is that the value of that piece actually skyrocketed, not when it was made, but when another artist came by and ripped it off the wall and ate it, right? And then it was recreated, and that recreated version is the one that actually has all the worth, because that one was the one that was attached to this news story, into this viral to this whole kind of viral conversation. Like, all of a sudden, that's when it started gaining worth. People didn't care about this banana being taped to the wall until the banana being taped to the wall was like in the headlines, and now all of a sudden it's like it's got that sense, and now it's worth trading. Like, people know about it. Now we can actually trade it for something. Now we can actually think about it in terms of value or price.
It's even weirder than that, but we won't go into it too much. But it's not even the fact that now there's another banana.
Yeah.
Because the banana actually doesn't matter.
That's right, isn't it?
Like, the piece is not the banana and the duct tape.
And in some ways, you were talking about it being a bond, right? Isn't there literally like some sort of a certificate that gives people the permission to recreate that piece in certain circumstances? Yeah.
And that's what you buy.
Yeah.
You buy the ability to tape a banana to a wall in a particular arrangement and say that, I think it's Maurizio Catalan, and say this is a Maurizio Catalan piece. That's what you're buying. You're not buying a banana and duct tape.
Yeah.
Because the banana and duct tape don't matter. And this is where, like, artists have been trying to figure out, how do we get around this problem of the physical object? It just lends itself to money laundering. And that's what the majority of the art market is.
Yeah.
So when you walk into a museum and you're thinking about, what is art to me? And then you hear all of these things about money, and you think about how much it costs, and the fact that the museums are subsidized by our tax dollars, all of this complex web of what on earth our economy is, and to know that that's all being corrupted to some extent, either corrupted or, if you're a positivist in it, curated,
harnessed,
harnessed through the sense of what money does.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I talk about this to point out, if we use a valuation like art is important if its value goes up on the secondary market. That is one nexus point of a way to value art. And this idea, as soon as you start revealing this and you realize the people who collect large amounts of artwork and who are, I'm trying not to hit this table too much. The people who collect large amounts of artwork and are spending huge amounts of money on the work, by and large, do not care what the artwork is. They don't value the aesthetic experience. The average museum goer is looking for an aesthetic experience. And that's why I like thinking about what Berry's getting at, because it points out that all of our individual definitions of like what we like in art, it's not actually a definition of art. What we're saying is, this is the avenue of art that I care about. So I'm not going to judge the people who go to Sotheby's and engage in that. Like, they're going to get more power anyway, so it doesn't matter if I say more power to them. But in the sense of like what they're doing, like, that is not for me as an artist to really engage with. That's more of an ethical conversation that hopefully those people are involved in.
Hopefully.
But then when I think about it as an art viewer, then I can realize, well, that's not what I care about. I don't really care how expensive a work is, because I understand that has a huge degree of manipulation at play. And it can be so apparent in the ways that a lot of artworks are stored before they go to auction in New York. They're stored in a big facility that's in Delaware. The artworks get shipped to New York to be auctioned off. And then we have these papers from the Panama Papers that show that the artworks get delivered to the same facility in Delaware.
Yeah.
It's like, so I thought someone bought it. Shouldn't it be shipped somewhere?
Yeah.
And then it's sold, a year later for another price.
Yep.
And it's like, there's something happening there.
No, yeah.
That I certainly don't know how to play that game.
Yeah, I don't understand what's happening there. I don't understand what the chess game behind that is. But yeah.
Which brings me to why we're talking about Pinocchio.
Pinocchio. Here we go.
Pinocchio is not a monetarily valuable thing anymore.
Not anymore.
It's now on the public domain. That's why like 3 or 4 years ago there was like 2 new Pinocchio movies that came out. Like it's a old story that you can't copyright any longer. And Disney can hold like some parameters, but of course, Guillermo del Toro did his terrible version of Pinocchio. It's terrible in the sense that he breaks the story, but we'll talk about that. Maybe we'll talk about that.
I knew he was gonna. I figured he was gonna come because we've talked about his movies before. But
yeah.
And then what was the other one? There was another Pinocchio that
I think they did. Didn't they do like a Tom Hanks version that was still by Disney or something?
Oh, I'm not sure about that.
I don't remember. Disney did another one,
Okay.
and it was almost a complete shot-for-shot remake, but I think they changed some things or whatever.
Oh.
But the one we're thinking about is the old one, which is like 1920s, 30s?
Yeah, it's really old animation at this point. Yeah.
And Jordan Peterson goes, and he is somehow able, like one thing, he's very verbose.
Yes.
He goes on sidetracks. But think about what he's doing. In the context of what Barry's getting at, does Pinocchio remind Jordan Peterson of very many things?
I mean, it seems like an infinitely varied number of things. Like you get the sense that the only reason why he's reining himself in is because he's teaching a class, and like he needs to kind of wrap things up within his lecture time. But it seems like he could kind of tangent off of tangent almost infinitely from the singular starting place of Pinocchio.
Yeah, this is where like the way I've been thinking about it is this idea of a meaning matrix. So Barry doesn't use the word nexus point, but he says something like it's like an artwork is like a center of a complex web of reminders. I like to think about that like if you imagine a huge network, I like to think of a tree, but a stem where things are connected to things in the past. Then there's manners in which some artworks are heavily connected to that network, and some of them are loosely connected.
Yeah.
And if you think through, so Peterson is getting at an idea that Pinocchio is heavily connected to whatever human beings think is meaningful.
Yeah.
I mean, specifically, like if you had to summarize why has Peterson used Pinocchio as his example for his class?
I think, to sum up an enormous amount of content, it seems like at the end of the day, what he's trying to get at is that Pinocchio stands as, in some ways, a collection of story archetypes. Like it's in some ways this like a huge assemblage of all of these different myths and ideas and stories, particularly ones I believe that are held in great importance to Western culture, but in some ways that Pinocchio can be viewed as the product of years and years and years and years of stories being told, and it's all kind of, for whatever reason, congealed into this one 1920s animated movie. By the Disney company. Yeah.
What is like without describing what happens in the film, like Pinocchio goes to Pleasure Island, he gets donkey ears, he goes into a whale. Without describing that, what would you say the story is about?
I think at its very core, what it is it's a story about. So we're going to talk a little bit about, because there's one of the most important characters in it is Jiminy Cricket, right? This cricket who acts as kind of in the beginning a malfunctioning conscience, and then later begins to take on a more and more important role. So what it is overall is a story of somebody who comes into the world and goes on a journey, and through the process of this journey kind of finds what they think is important and is able to make value-based decisions in their life. That's what it is. It's somebody who finds a system of values.
Yeah. What does Pinocchio start as?
Wooden puppet.
A wooden boy.
Yeah.
What is he trying to become?
Yeah, he's trying to become a real boy.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that path, how do you start as an empty-headed puppet and become an autonomous individual who knows how to be good and true and brave. I believe that's what the fairy godmother tells him to do.
Yeah.
And it's like the path to becoming good, true, and brave requires the development of the conscious and like a taking on of doing the right thing. That's what the story's about.
Yeah.
It's like it's not about a wooden boy necessarily. The wooden boy is an image to talk about what does it mean to be empty and controlled with strings attached, even if you don't physically have strings attached.
Yeah.
It's like it's getting at all of these different things. So if you think about it like that, it's like the reason, like why Peterson uses that is he has a different mode of valuation. For him, he's thinking about the more connected to the network of meaning. I mean, his course is called Maps of Meaning.
Yeah.
The more connected an artwork is to this network of meaning, the more important it is. And that's what you're getting at, like the distillation of story, all of these myths coming down of, well, I mean, elements of Jonah and the whale is in there.
Yeah.
You have, there's a scene at the beginning when Geppetto has just made Pinocchio and he comes to life and he's got all those clocks.
Yeah.
And all the clocks have different references to different folk tales, specifically from Europe.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's tying those things together. And like, think about that image of, there's a manner in which, one of the clocks that is really distinct in my mind is a woman spanking her son.
Yeah.
And it's like a folk tale.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's represented as a music playing timepiece. It's like our manner of where we find ourselves in time is these different story representations. And this one weird movie is making reference to all those things, saying at this moment in time, when Pinocchio comes alive, all of those clocks, all of those stories are keeping time with him. And they're playing the same song. It's like, oh man, like that's just rife with meaning.
And I think to talk briefly about the imagery in the movie, one of the most important, I think probably the most significant detail, like breakdown wise, that I hadn't ever realized before. It was a movie that I haven't watched it in a long time, but in the very beginning of the movie, as the kind of adventure starts, those clocks actually all stop for some reason. There's no explanation given for why all of a sudden all these clocks, which represent all these different stories, stop, but it like implies that you're entering into some sort of like a dream sequence, or some sort of like you've departed from the reality of linear time. You've departed from the reality of like our day-to-day lives, and we've entered into this space where time isn't working quite as it should be, and maybe things now don't mean exactly what they're supposed to mean. And then finally at the end of the story, like you said, the music starts playing again, all of the clocks start moving again, and in some ways, like all of those stories start to move again in a really, really fascinating way. Yeah.
It's like you can start to see, like at a base level, I think humans automatically value art because of the meaning they find in it. And so you can see when we have, when we're growing up and we remember back, man, the thing I used to watch as a kid all the time, like that one movie or something. Yeah. It's still our favorite, even though we go back and we watch it and we realize how clumsy it is, how like stupid the song is or the writing is or something. Yeah. It's embarrassing. But when we think about it, we realize it was still meaningful to me. And that idea, and this is where so much of the interaction with contemporary and modern art comes into play, where it's been disconnected because of its the thing it's pursuing has moved beyond this idea of creating folk traditions.
Yeah.
It has moved beyond being connected to that network of meaning, and it's looking for the most fringe connections.
Yeah.
And because of that, the general audience that hasn't kept up with that narrative of, art just took this major diversion over here.
Yep.
Where like now I'm supposed to look at splatter painting and I'm supposed to, color fields and poop in cans.
Yeah, I'm supposed to understand the meaning of this. Yeah.
Right. It's supposed to be, I'm supposed to find this valuable. And gone are all of these, what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to not be controlled by authority figures?
Yeah.
What does it mean to save your father from the belly of the whale?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to open your eyes? What does it mean to have a conscience?
Yeah.
What does it mean for your conscience to actually like win a gold medallion?
Yeah.
There's all kinds of strange things that are far more connected to human experience.
Which is why I think in some ways cinema and story and movies are oftentimes, I think they're viewed as a highly accessible form of art, because one of their goals is to be understandable by a broad audience, and that has two parts, one of which is the commercial success, right? Like if people understand your story, they're going to like it a lot better. But interestingly enough, I'd say the same sorts of people end up working on both projects. Like people who animate movies are really like the likelihood of those people having gone to an art school and understanding all the more complicated kind of divergences and things happening in the art world are very, very high.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that made animation back then so important, because even today it really is an art form.
Mm-hmm.
And what you had on that movie was a team of artists who were working together, and they understood all of those references and points and ties back they were making.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So earlier I forced you to say that the art market is part of the art world. So let's cut out the art market.
Yeah.
What do you think the art world then, which like how would you define that? What is that? If it's not the market, what is it?
If it's not the market, I think it's got two parts, where it's got people who are actively creating things, and then there's the audience. You have both like the creator and the interpreter or the viewer, and it's got these two parts. And the creators are people who, for whatever reason, decide that it's time to not be engineers or doctors, and that they would rather paint or write poetry or write books. And then you have all of these other people who are like engaging in that work for some reason. These people who are doctors and engineers and still think it's worth their time to read books and watch movies and go to museums and like look at paintings.
So the artists and the actual appreciators,
Yeah.
not necessarily the buyers and sellers.
Yeah.
Where does that take place? Are you talking museums, galleries? What kinds of spaces does it happen in?
I think it's interesting because it happens in so many different spaces. It happens both in these kind of traditional areas where you talk about like a gallery or a museum. I think about, so I grew up in Detroit. The DIA is like the classic space where it's like you can see all this historical art and all this new art. It's a fantastic museum, and like everybody in Detroit has been to that museum. Like I feel like everybody has been there at some point. But then also it's happening in bookstores and concert venues and weird my friend is having this strange underground concert party, and we're all gonna go here, or my friend wrote this book that you should take a look at. Like it's happening on all of these different levels.
Okay, so that's what we're talking about. Perfect. What does that group value today? Like
which group?
this whole art world that you're talking about.
Oh yeah.
The like put it all together, from the weird spaces, the more professional spaces, the DIA, the people who go to the DIA.
Yeah.
What are they generally valuing?
I think the most common trend that I'm seeing in art right now is art is about understanding somebody else's experience. Like that's what so much of the art being made today is about. Is this is how I feel. This is what I'm thinking about. This is what it means to be a person like me. And this art is a bridge for you to like understand that on some level. That's what a lot of the art being made today is about.
So I would call that the current trend.
Yeah.
Is towards art that is in that avenue.
Mm-hmm.
But why is that the popular what am I trying to maybe just I'll say this not in the form of a question to try to get at to see if like what I think is happening is that we get these trends every few years.
Yeah.
And the thing that's common about all the trends is that they're seemingly new ideas. There's like some sort of I mean that's literally they're looking for identities that have not been represented within the canon yet.
Yeah.
Whether you like that or not, that's the idea is literally find a new voice that we haven't seen before, and we want to look at that not because it's beautiful art, not because it'll necessarily hold value on the secondary market,
Yeah.
but literally because it's new.
No, yeah, and it's this idea of, I think a lot of times something that's valued in art is also, maybe you would call it an emotional experience, right? Like being able to connect on some level when like feel something, right? Like that's like ultimately what I feel like so many people are looking for, whether or not that's a movie or a song or a painting, but like people like songs that make them feel something. Like if it's a sad song, you want to feel like you're really sad after you listen to it, or if it's a happy movie, like you want to like walk away like smiling. And I think that this art that is really based off of sharing personal experiences, that's another strong goal of it, and that's one of the reasons why people are so drawn to it, is that it really can be incredibly effective of putting you in the shoes of somebody else. Like saying like, this is I think recently the art museum here at Hope did a whole series of a printmaking exhibition. It might actually still be up, and it's all about the Chinese modern printmaking. And so what it really does is it starts years ago, and it takes you through the kind of beginnings of the communist revolution in China all the way to what it's like living in China today. And it's an incredibly emotional experience to kind of walk through and feel this like, oh, like this is what it's like. It felt like for these artists to live in China at all of these different times. And it's an incredibly effective gallery. Like I really love it. And I think more and more that's the sort of art that I'm seeing in museums and galleries.
Right. And that's where like so for really since modernism, so I put it around 1870. This whole trend, this notion that something new, we're looking for a new experience. A lot of that came out of modernism because of the the Enlightenment leading to the Industrial Revolutions, and this sense that we could make a new world. We could try, like we were perfecting humanity. We were headed towards the distant future. And you see all these trends start fracturing off. If you look back, like some of this is definitely the way that historians generalize and organize timeframes, but there is way less divergence in the contemporary practices of artists pre-1800s. And as soon as you get into the 1800s, there's suddenly this like fracturing out. If you get the Impressionists and the Expressionists and the people still trying to do neoclassicism, you get all of these strange things because suddenly there isn't a unified vision as to what art should be. Instead, it's far more like what could it be? Artists start pursuing these questions, and we start getting, in the modern terms, this idea of the avant-garde. You've heard that in good. Avant-garde being the tip of the spear, like the person who's out front. And Clement Greenberg famously champions this. He writes an essay called The New Laocoon. Have you read that in any of your classes?
Selections of it in art history class,
and in it, he's talking about we're searching for a new pinnacle of the greatness of art. And he's a very good modernist. I do think that he's a very limited view of what modernism was about, but he's the most popular view that like the people today who hate on modernists, they're actually just hating on Greenbergian modernism. And he's saying we're searching for a pure new aesthetic, one that hasn't been done before. And his poster boy was Jackson Pollock. For folks who don't know, everyone knows a Pollock when they see one, and that's the splatter painting. And every single like art student at some point tries to make a Pollock knockoff. They try to do Pollock better than Pollock, which is very difficult.
It's very difficult.
They always say like my kid couldn't make this. There's a lot more going on in those.
There really is, which I think is that's a whole nother conversation. But that kind of argument of anybody could do this is really, I think the best response to that is like try, like just try, and like if you really think you can make a blue square that's better than Rothko's, like go out there and try and make a blue square that's better than Rothko's.
Well, and that's where I would say in the 1960s, and we were maybe at that place where it looked easier than it was, but today I think Banksy really turned the world upside down when he made Exit Through the Gift Shop and turned I believe his name is Terry Gutierrez or something like that. Into Mr. Brainwash. Mr. Brainwash is like it's actually perfect we're talking about this today because Mr. Brainwash is the shadow version of Pinocchio. How do you take a real person and turn them into a puppet? That's what Exit Through the Gift Shop is about.
Yeah.
I think it's debatable as to whether Banksy, if that it is a work of art made by Banksy, as in Mr. Brainwash is Banksy's artwork, or if something really weird happened to the gentleman who now is called Mr. Brainwash in the process of him trying to make a documentary film.
There's a lot of, yes, you could go into that, and the identities of who those artists were and what their ideas were is really complicated.
But so you can see, so as soon as Greenberg puts forward this notion, and again, it is one element of particularly the academic art world, is this Greenbergian notion of this avant-garde approach. You can see right there why artwork starts to become less connected to that network of meaning. Because literally we're looking for new connections.
Yeah.
And the further out you go, the less connected you are to the trunk of that network. And so it's not surprising that you start getting, splatter paint, and we're supposed to take that seriously.
Yeah.
Color fields. To me, the ultimate of that path that Greenberg was going for was Ad Reinhardt, maybe Donald Judd, but Ad Reinhardt is pretty clear with this, of white on white paintings, black on black paintings. He has this really, I've done it in one of my videos in the past, a statement about one of his pieces, and it's as if he's making work for a robot.
Yeah.
Because it's trying to be as disconnected from human experience as possible. And in my opinion, it's like, okay, so that's not for humans to look at.
Yeah.
And he's doing this, I think Reinhardt's doing this to challenge Greenberg. Because after Greenberg sees Reinhardt's work, he starts to change his tone a little bit. And even Pollock, near the end of his life, he complained that with Greenberg, he couldn't talk to Greenberg about the things he really liked, which was he was very into Jungian archetypes.
Yeah.
And he thought that his work was tapping into the original creative enterprise of our ancestors in caves who were spitting pigment over their hands and leaving marks.
Yeah.
And he's like, whatever I'm doing is more like that than what Rembrandt's doing.
Yep.
And he was like, I want to talk about this, but Greenberg won't let me.
Yeah.
And then he started, so when he was really fascinated by Greenberg, he was naming his paintings numbers.
Yeah.
Untitled number 1,
Yep.
And then after that, he started renaming them these epic, like mythic terms. And then of course, as I believe, I can't remember who wrote it. I think it was Greenberg, but it might have been like Jerry Saltz or something. No, it was Greenberg. How he wrapped himself around a telephone pole with his car. That's how Pollock died. But that poetic turn of phrase is interesting for Greenberg to write because it's so not modernist. It's very romantic.
Yeah.
But this kind of gets at a brief explanation of what's happening here. It's not, I would argue, it's not that art is changing what it is, but rather our valuation of what we think is important about art has changed drastically from the 1800s. There was a moment in time where people would say it's only good art if it like glorifies God.
Yeah.
Or if it glorifies the king.
Yep.
Or if it glorifies, my genius coming into the Renaissance.
Yeah.
Of like the genius of Da Vinci, the genius of Michelangelo, which also, of course, had to be slightly below the church. But it's really high up there, especially when you think about the genius of, who did the Duomo? I always forget his name. It wasn't Botticelli.
No.
But the architect of it, whatever. It's like you're building a church for God, but you're also trying to celebrate your own genius as an architect.
There's and there is this I think to tie a couple of things we're talking about together here, like as we're talking about maps and this tip of the spear idea, it's interesting to think about because a lot of when you talk about fracturing happening at some time in the 1870s, people were still like this trailblazing was still based off of this one central point, and in reality that trailblazing wasn't even though they might be going somewhere new, it is still connected. Like you can still trace it back, and I think that's incredibly apparent when you hear even the artists who you'd you look at their work and you go, how in the world is Jackson Pollock related to the Sistine Chapel? And it's like, well, they were way more related than you'd think, and visually that's obscure at best. But this trailblazing effort was still really happening in connection to those things, and in art classes we often talk about like the painting tradition, the painting canon, right? Like what is this kind of and in some ways it's a pretty linear, the way it's laid out is super linear, where it's like kind of this Western painting canon that, you know, you're just kind of bouncing around Central Europe for a long time, and then you'll shoot off to France and bounce back. But it's all so connected to those same ideas, and even when you started getting these painters who were doing radically different things than sculptors who were doing radically different things, they were aware of and taking, you know, in reality very small steps away from the canon, and not, you know, so far that it would be impossible for them to start somewhere new. They're still on the same map.
Yeah, it's basically we human beings are such mimetic creatures. We copy each other so much that this idea of the individual creative genius is suspect at best. And when you start looking into the geniuses we've had, and you know, you start to see the phenomena of mutual discovery disconnected across in all kinds of realms of, like, you know, someone started doing splatter painting here and here.
Yeah.
For some reason, this one became more popular.
Yeah.
Someone's, you know, doing this form of abstraction, or like someone invented the light bulb here and here at the same time.
Yeah.
It's like we're way less unique, and artists seem to be far more in tune to where, I'm not even going to call it culture, I would just say like the steady march of time through change. Artists frequently are at the cusp of that. I wouldn't necessarily go to the extent to say that's a point. That's an avant-garde.
Yeah.
But it is in front somehow. Whether that's a positive or a negative is really, I mean, that's where postmodernism comes in and says, like, yeah, this modernist notion that we're heading towards a better place. No, we're just cycling.
Yeah.
Something like that. Or we're not doing anything, actually. Could be, you know, the extreme.
Which I think you can see is you can look at even as we kind of dive into these areas of painting, and we're talking pretty exclusively maybe about this kind of artistic reference, which is like what am I trying to say here? As we think so much about painting and this tradition of painters, you can also go back and look at art which should be not related at all. Things like cave paintings, or African masks, or indigenous paintings, or the scroll painting traditions in China. And it's so much easier than you'd think to kind of find through lines and ties and link them into this same map than you would ever imagine. Like the amount of the degrees of separation between a cave painting and a sculpture, the urinal in the art gallery is so much smaller than I feel like you could ever imagine, and that's weird, and it's kind of uncanny, but I think it's also really important as we talk about these kind of maps and how closely things are linked together.
Yeah, even let's talk about that or I'll go off on it for a brief second here. You know, he turns it on its side and he calls it the fountain.
Yeah.
And it's like, what does that remind you of? It's like, well, it reminds you of probably other fountains.
We should say, so we're talking about Marcel Duchamp.
Yes,
and
Duchamp's the fountain.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, the broader your network in your own mind of like the broader of meaningful connections you've made in life, the more you can see how it might be connected to things. And so it's like the fountain is connected to fountains, it's connected to bathrooms, it's connected to urinals. And then I think about all of the different kinds of jokes between like public urination and the development of, you know, bathhouses and plumbing and the Romans. And then I think about, oh wait, fountains are actually coming from places where in Ovid's Metamorphosis, so many of the bad interactions with gods happen around water. And then you realize like the fountain is a mysterious place where you both clean yourself, but also there's alligators in there.
Yeah.
It's like you see all of these things of like, what could Duchamp mean? And I actually think that this to me is like bringing us not full circle, but bringing us around to my argument against Greenberg and actually against Duchamp. Duchamp failed in what he was trying to do. He was trying to be a good postmodernist, and but they didn't have a name for it then. And Greenberg's trying to be a good modernist. We're heading towards pure aesthetic experience that is virtuous in and of itself. It has no external reference, and it is just purely true. He's trying to whittle art down to one thing.
Yeah.
Which really means you only need one work of art. And he's just wrong.
Yeah.
Like he is mistaking what's happening to the extent that Jonathan Anderson and William Dearness in their book The Modern Art and the Life of a Culture, Modern Art and the Life of a Culture, deftly show that all of the artists that Greenberg is pushing forward in this very narrow subset of modernist ideology denied it. Rothko, saying that Rothko was all about pure experience. No, he's thinking about religion. He's thinking about death. He's thinking about mourning.
Yep.
He's thinking about the abyss and the transcendent through the paint.
Yeah.
I would argue that what the modernists are doing is realizing that they're asking the question of what makes art meaningful. And we have famously Marguerite's "This Is Not a Pipe," The Treachery of Images.
Yeah.
And it's this realization of, well, maybe it's not necessarily what's represented. What if it's just the paint? And so you can see through the span of the 20th century, these modernists are trying to say, at what point do we get to base material that we actually can't find any meaning in it? That's the real modernist project, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Not this, where's the pure aesthetic, where we finally find pure art. It's no, is there anything that is meaningless?
Yeah.
And weirdly enough, I think they found that everything's meaningful.
Yeah.
Everything can be meaningful. Artist's poop can, banana. It might not be that meaningful, but it's still, everything's connected to that network, even if just loosely.
And it's also fair to say its meaning might be bad, or its meaning might be found in so that it's like it's saying something that's false. Like that's an important thing to discover, is that just because we can point at it and find meaning in it, that meaning doesn't necessarily have to reflect some of those ideas that Berry brought up in The Responsibility of the Poet about like reminding you of positive things, bringing you this like sense of like Berry, as he talked about words and how poetry can kind of be a transcendent experience through like the ability of using grammar and the shape and form of words. Like a bad painting can just remind you of bad paintings. That's like an equally true statement. Or a bad poem can be like, wow, words can sound really bad if you put them in the wrong order. Like that can happen.
Well, and that's where if you start valuing artwork based on its meaning instead of on all of these other things, then you're going to be able to acknowledge that there are celebrated works of art that are selling for millions of dollars and they're not that meaningful. You also will be able to say, this thing that I'm looking at, that other people find immense value in, it's not very meaningful to me. And there's many reasons why. Number one, when that happens, you might want to say to yourself, is that my fault? Like, am I the thing that is not quite ready, or is it the artwork's fault? If I, like I'll be honest, like I still struggle with Rothkos, especially because there are some bad Rothkos. But sometimes I look at a Rothko and I'm not in a place to stand before it and gaze into it and really let it work on me because, I've been in a museum for too long. My hips are hurting. I've got a bad back. I'm hungry.
Yep.
I'm just not ready.
There's other people walking around. It's like not a great place to look at a Rothko. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And there's all kinds of reasons why it's like at that moment in time when I'm frustrated and I'm what I call museumed out, the artwork disappears and it becomes scenery, like wallpaper. And then it's not functioning as art anymore. It's no longer reminding me of anything. If anything, it's mostly annoying. Yeah. It's like, how do I get out of this maze? Like get me to the bathroom, get me to a place to sit down. And everyone's had this, like everyone has varying degrees of ability. Like I've spent 8 hours in a museum straight before. Most people can't handle that. I probably can't handle that anymore, given my injuries have increased. And almost all of them have concrete floors these days. Like, it's so hard to stand. But so it's like there's these varying degrees. I want to circle back to one thing I said about Duchamp, just in case we don't have time to get at it before. But Duchamp also proves in my opinion, the faultiness of the postmodern agenda. Because postmodernism is certainly responding to the faults that we've discussed in modernism. But it says something along the lines of, like, Duchamp, there's an interesting video of him online where he's trying to talk about the ready-mades, which the urinal was the first ready-made. He found it ready-made, and all he did was slightly adjust it.
Yeah.
And he said he was looking for objects that they didn't have a positive aesthetic or a negative aesthetic, as in they weren't beautiful and they weren't ugly, they were purely neutral. He wanted to find something that was so neutral that it was almost invisible. Like we couldn't even see it.
Yeah.
Because it's so just blasé. And he stopped making the ready-mades because they have become iconic.
Yeah.
Which to me is the ultimate critique, to say Duchamp's enterprise, his goal, was impossible. We humans, like you said, the building up of a brand, the fact that Van Gogh is more important than random artists who draws just like him. We build some of these constructs of meaning through our social interactions.
Yeah.
And so the fountain has become an icon of the avant-garde, of pushing the envelope, of opening up the boundaries of what material could be used as art. Now it's filled with meaning.
Yeah.
He was trying to find something that would be so ubiquitous and dull that we wouldn't even want to assign meaning to it. And he utterly failed.
And it's literally taught in every art class, across the nation. Like it is like, probably across the world, I would imagine, is like, you cannot have a conversation about that time period of art without learning about it. And everybody upon seeing that slide that pops up is going to assign meaning to that object, even if that's just a base value judgment of that's dumb, or it's a little bit interesting on what he's trying to get at there.
It's like the postmodernists say, well, we can never know the meaning, and so therefore there is none. But the reality is that we human beings, we are looking to assign meaning.
Yeah.
Like we are looking for meaning in things. And that's how we navigate the world. That's like, you know what something means, or you search for it so that it can like make sense in your reality, however that reality plays out.
Yeah.
And it's like, if it doesn't have an obvious meaning to you, you don't see it.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is like a really difficult, strange thing to realize, but it's like this room. We've seen a lot of things in this room. We've seen the microphone, the computer, the table, my notes and everything. And it's because we know what those things are. But there are things in this room that we haven't noticed. And it's like, that's what the artists are trying to do, is what are the non-obvious things? At least the artists today, what they're trying to do. Contemporary artists, they're trying to find, is there some other place that we haven't noticed meaning? Which is why we're interested in unique voices so much right now as the current trend, is do these other people who we haven't heard from, do they have another vision?
Yeah.
Do they have something that we didn't notice? And oftentimes the answer is yes.
Yeah, it is.
Sometimes it's not.
Yeah, but there's this enormous. I think one of the strongest cases for like diversity in the arts is basically saying that like, different people notice different things. Different people's lives lead them to different places and allow them to have unique views and perspectives on things that, me and you who are both, you weren't born in Michigan, but you were, two Americans who have, been through, in some ways, like roughly the same life path. Like we both ended up here at Hope College. We're going to notice extremely different things about a room when we walk into it than maybe going back to the museum exhibition, somebody who was born in the 50s in communist China and is like just now like walking into this room for the first time. Like there's a reason why that person has something different to say about the room, because they're going to have an incredibly different experience of the room than either me or you like even could. Yeah,
exactly. Which brings us back to Pinocchio. To wrap this up.
Yeah.
My hope with this conversation is to think to the more you become mindful of what you value in art and what other people value in art, the broader your horizons can expand. And you can have less of a frustrated response, because the majority of lay people, the average man walking into a museum, seeing this strange contemporary art, has no manner in which to conceptualize how it connects to anything that his world is. It doesn't remind him of anything. All it does is it frustrates him. I paid good money to be here. It's always the best money that you waste. You never waste bad money. You always waste good money.
Yep.
And that's a Dusty Slay joke. I'll give him credit. And it's like, that's frustrating. We know why we value money. And then you walk in and you see, Campbell's soup cans over and over.
Yeah, I could have went to the supermarket for free.
Exactly.
I could have walked into the restroom in this museum and seen the same fountain.
Because that art enterprise that is happening in the art world, that most nebulous form, not the art. It is happening in the art market as well, but because the art market is not that original, they're just a bunch of con men. Not all of them.
I was going to say your true thoughts on the art market just slipped out for a second there.
But what's happening there is a different form of valuation, not a valuation of what is the most core to our meaning matrix, but is what is most fringe.
Yeah.
And as soon as you understand that, you as an individual interacting with the art can decide if that is a meaningful area to you. If I walk in and it's artwork about, the glories of cement, like the Museum of Fine Arts Boston famously has a photograph of the wall that the photograph is hung on. I don't care. I get it. I get how it fits into what was happening in that era of photography. I don't care. And then as soon as I say that, now for like the next week, I'm going to be thinking about that piece. Like, is there something else there that I haven't considered? Am I being an arrogant jerk, not taking it seriously? Which is what happened with the banana piece for me. Like I was on a podcast where we talked about the banana piece for like an hour, and by the end, it's like there's a lot of meaning there. There's a lot more than meets the eye.
Yeah.
But that's the strange thing of contemporary art, is that it's way more connected to that matrix of meaning. But the connections are not as obvious. They're like thin connections instead of these thick connections, which is the weird thing of like what is happening as our world changes and as our memory changes. There were people who watched Pinocchio and got it back in the 1920s.
Yeah.
They understood it as a exploration in the development of a human consciousness. How does a little kid go from being controlled, you're controlled by your parents, to an autonomous individual, one that might save his father, save culture.
Yeah.
It's like that's what it's exploring.
Yeah.
There was a time when people saw that. Most people today watch Pinocchio and they just think it's about a wooden. The story is what it is.
What a strange story about a wooden boy.
Right.
This is the interpretation, and I think I would like to add there is this sense of we talk about culture and like those people might have had a different understanding. Like it's important to recognize that the original story of Pinocchio wasn't just some strange story that somebody wrote to tell a story about a puppet. Like all of those stories, and for the longest time, every story that was worth being written down and recorded and retold was told because it had some sort of a strong, meaningful connection. I don't know if it was a...
I don't fully agree with that. But the only reason is it's not that every story was told that did that. It's that every story that we remembered did that.
That's fair.
So there was tons of stories being told, just like right now. That's one of the things I say when people are like, contemporary art today is like garbage.
Yeah.
It's like, well, we haven't waited.
Yeah.
Like, you look back to 1,000 years ago, and it's like people at some point, I've moved all throughout my life. We constantly have things, and we're like, is this worth saving or not? And you throw away so much stuff. From books, works of art that we don't have the space.
Yep.
It's like, but there's things that make it. And it's like what we have now from the past is all the stuff that made it.
Yeah.
And that's what time does. Time is a distillation of the good things, and they stayed along. And so all the things that are really tied into that matrix of meaning lasted. And everything that wasn't, we just don't even know it existed.
Yeah.
But then we think, well, there were so many more geniuses in the past. I don't think that's... maybe there was a time in Florence where there was a lot of geniuses for some reason.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's like damning of today.
No, yeah.
We're just like, there's more people making art than ever before. And you just have to realize that at all times, a huge majority of the art is garbage. And that's what the galleries are trying to do. And then it's a question for you to think, so what galleries align with the thing I value? You know, where I value, you know, whatever. Maybe you're really into craftsmanship.
Yeah.
I value the best quality of a particular, you know, of painting. Find the gallery that does that. It exists.
Yeah.
Lots of galleries don't value that. Don't go to them. They're not catering to you. You know, it's like, I'm gluten-free. I'm not going to go to, you know, the bakery.
Yeah.
That's what you just need to do.
Yeah,
it's not to say that bakeries are bad. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think another point I'd like to kind of put onto this conversation is that, and I hope this wasn't the what it sounded like we were saying, but postmodernism was an incredibly important movement. I feel like we spent a lot of this conversation talking about some of like postmodernism failing and postmodern artists that we did or didn't like.
Yeah.
But postmodernism is essentially the groundwork of what is making this conversation, and I would even argue Jordan Peterson's whole course, Maps of Meaning, possible. It is a postmodernism conversation that we are able to have now.
Yes, and I teach in a very postmodern manner.
Yeah,
which is why. So we'll talk about Rauschenberg, who's one of my favorite artists, who's clearly a postmodernist.
Oh yeah, I'm not super familiar.
Is really bringing it through. But yeah, that's like what I'm trying to say is both modernism and postmodernism, they're like opposite extremes. And I think a better route to understanding art is having a foot in both camps. And it's like a lot of the things the modernists were doing was amazing. If what they got at was almost everything can be meaningful, what the postmodernists are getting at is that almost like one way in which things can become meaningful is by changing your perspective of it.
Yeah.
That is not the thing necessarily, but it's in you. And it's like that's right in the middle of what Berry's getting at. That's what he said, right? Every work of art is a complex web of reminders. What that means is the work of art is there. It's like the vessel, and the reminding is the viewer.
Yeah.
And it's between those two things, between modernity and postmodernity, you come together and you have the experience of art, which actually like ties back to medieval thinking.
I think so, and I think it's interesting because as this conversation has went on, it seems like what we've kind of gotten to is we've defined another set of criteria by which things are meaningful. So when we talked about Berry's poem, some of the things he talked about were kind of like the pure craftsmanship qualities, the form of the form of the letter, the form of the word, the form of like how poetry works. We talked about this element of reminding, and now we're talking more so about a third category, which is this kind of personal interaction more so, which is even, I'd say, different in some ways than the reminding, because what we're talking about is your ongoing experience of a piece of art like adds to it in so many ways, where it's like I think that even since our last recording, any piece of art that we've talked about in that recording is now associated with that conversation we have. And I actually think about Wendell Berry in relation to so many of the pieces of art that we talked about now, which has added meaning to them and makes me like them quite a deal more. Or and now I can't think about Wendell Berry without thinking about some of the other pieces of art. Like it goes both ways.
That's exactly why I had you watch Jordan Peterson, whether you agree with him or not. What it shows you is that's a person who's looking at an artwork and realizing all the things it reminds him of. And it's so many things.
Yeah.
He goes on and on and on, taking each scene apart.
Yeah.
To ad nauseum, to a degree that it's like, you're like, please just finish the story.
It legitimately is almost that there's some point in it where you realize that you're only a third of the way through the movie, because like they just then get into the whale. You're like, oh my, I thought we were wrapping this up. Like I can't believe it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because some people aren't going to like that about a work of art. In fact, some people are going to be like, I don't know, I'll try to give them grace, but really, I don't know if I can. Like, I would say that there's like a cultural air to that of superiority of, I don't need it to remind me of the complex network of the human endeavor. I need it to be far more nuanced, But that's like, the difference between like really, really fine wine and boxed wine. The boxed wine companies are making more money than most fine wine companies. There are some fine wines that are making an astronomical amount of money.
Yeah.
And then the average of the low end is making a lot more money than most of those high end suppliers. And it's the same thing in the arts.
Yeah.
Like the Marvel movies made so much money compared to any artist. But then there's a few like Damien Hirst, Gerhard Richter, Peter Doig, Takashi Murakami, even though in 2020 he was doing poorly financially. That's all like this very different kind of they're making a lot of money, but then you've got your painter on the corner who's just making watercolors of and that person's making way more money than me.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do you judge the value? That's
Yeah.
the point of thinking about art as this complex web of reminders. Allows us to realize it's not that it's not art, it's that that's not what I care about in art.
I think what we're getting at, and one of the questions that I'm interested to dive into more as we continue these conversations, is where we've talked about meaning in so many different ways, and one of the things that's kind of come up is meaning inherent to these objects? Is meaning purely a product of our interaction with them? Like where does this meaning originate from?
Yeah, good question.
And we've talked about all these different ways that we define meaning, but so far a lot of them are fairly dependent on our experience of them. And the question that I'm kind of finding myself asking now is, well, do I find meaning in a painting because I'm able to give it meaning, or was there meaning there already and this was a process of discovery? Or is this interaction that I'm having with a painting where I'm able to uncover more meaning in it? Is that something in me, or is there something in the painting, or is it both?
Yeah. That's our cue.
That's
headed towards where we're going, because I can't remember exactly what I assigned next, but we're going to do Ellen Winter's book next. How art works.
All right.
Gets at that question.
Well,
hopefully the lights going out was not too distracting.
I hope so.
Oh, good stuff.